Open your mind. Let the conversation begin.
Imagine logging into your bank account on just a random Tuesday morning, right? And coming to this sudden, chilling realization that you don't actually own anything.
Yeah, that's a terrifying thought.
Right. And I'm not just talking about the big things. I mean, you don't own your car because a missed payment disables the engine software. You don't own your favorite movies because, well, they live on a server that you just rent access to.
You're essentially just licensing your own life.
Exactly. You don't own the software you use to do your job. And perhaps most terrifyingly, you don't even own the right to stay in your own neighborhood because, get this, 47.7% of your gross income is being siphoned off just to cover the entry fee to exist in a structure that's owned by a private equity firm.
It's staggering when you put it like that.
It really is. So welcome to this special presentation from the Mind Lounge Podcast Network. I'm thrilled you are here with us for this edition of The Deep Dive, where we take a stack of really complex information, cut through the noise, and, figure out what is mechanically happening right beneath the surface of our daily lives.
And today's mission is, frankly, massive.
Oh, yeah. Huge.
We are looking at this staggering convergence between the mundane, everyday economy that you interact with and a much, much larger global political ideology.
Yeah, and the connective tissue between those two spheres is the systematic evaporation of ownership. We are looking at an architecture that is fundamentally redesigning what it means to be a citizen versus what it means to just be a consumer.
Right. And to do this, we are pulling from a highly compelling stack of sources today. First, we have this really rigorous analytical deep dive into the economic mechanisms that are actively transforming regular people from asset owners into a permanent renter class.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is.
Yeah.
We're looking at the math behind the housing crisis, the subscription economy, and this systemic wealth transfer that's happening right under our noses.
Yeah, and alongside that economic data, we're overlaying a political commentary source. And this one dissects a growing, very intense conflict between what it defines as nationalist or patriot factions and globalist institutions.
Right. Focusing heavily on the World Economic Forum, the WEF.
Exactly. The battle over who actually wields cultural, economic, and political power in the 21st century.
We want to understand the load-bearing walls of their arguments, why are these specific claims resonating with such a massive demographic right now? What are the underlying mechanics they're pointing to?
And believe me, when you see the mechanics, the aha moment is just jarring. We are going to map out exactly how your $15 a month cloud storage subscription and the fact that a basic starter home is now entirely out of reach might actually be tube years in the exact same top-down geopolitical machine.
It sounds crazy until you see the math.
Right. So let's start with the macro. The bedrock of the American dream, which is currently undergoing a radical demolition, the housing market.
Yeah, it's the most logical entry point because housing is the historical anchor of middle-class wealth. And the data from our first source frames this crisis with a brutal statistic. They point out that housing costs now consume an astonishing 47.7% of household income.
Nearly half. I mean, almost 50 cents of every single dollar a household generates goes directly to a landlord or a bank just to keep the rain off their heads.
Yeah. And to understand the severity of that, you really have to look at the historical baseline. Because for decades, the golden rule of personal finance, the metric that banks use to underwrite mortgages, was that housing should not exceed 25 to roughly 30% of your gross income.
Right, the 30% rule.
Exactly. At 30%, the system breathes. You have discretionary income to inject into the local economy, you have capital to save for emergencies, and most importantly, you have the ability to invest and compound your wealth.
But when you forcefully push that baseline to nearly 50%, you're not just adjusting a household budget anymore.
No, you are mathematically eliminating the capacity for social mobility.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack this. I want to look at the analogy this source uses here, but I think we need to upgrade it a bit. The classic comparison is playing Monopoly, where the bank and the mega players have already bought up the entire board before you even roll the dice.
Right, so your only option is to land on their properties and bleed cash.
Yeah, but it's actually worse than that, isn't it? Because in Monopoly, everyone starts with the same amount of money and plays by the same rules. What this source is describing is a game where the rules themselves are bifurcated. Retail buyers, like regular people, are playing by one set of heavily regulated rules, while the mega players are playing an entirely different game.
That is the critical distinction. Let's look at the mechanics of a transaction to see how this works in reality. When a typical, say, 32-year-old couple tries to buy their first home, they're navigating an obstacle course of friction.
Oh, the paperwork alone.
Right. They need to secure a mortgage, which requires a deep dive into their credit history, strict debt-to-income ratios, and months of paperwork. And then they have to include contingencies in their offer.
Like an appraisal contingency to ensure the bank isn't lending more than the home is worth.
Yes, and an inspection contingency to ensure the roof isn't going to collapse in a week. All of these are protective measures, obviously, but they slow down the transaction and make the offer way less attractive to a seller.
I mean, if I'm selling my house, I want the sure thing. I don't want to wait 45 days only to find out the buyer's financing fell through because the appraisal came in 10 grand short.
Exactly. Now, enter the institutional investor. Wall Street private equity firms or massive corporate aggregators, they don't deal with retail mortgages.
Right, they have completely different funding.
They have access to immense pools of capital through commercial debt or institutional funds, often at interest rates far lower than what the retail buyer can access. So when they identify a target property, they come in with an all-cash offer.
Cash is king.
Always. And because it's cash, they routinely waive the appraisal contingency. Because they plan to either gut the house or slap a cheap, standardized renovation on it for the rental market, they frequently waive the inspection contingency too.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, though. Isn't this just, market efficiency? A lot of people rely on those corporate rental units because they want geographic mobility. Like, they might be remote workers who want to live in Austin for a year and then move to Denver. They don't want the anchor of a 30-year mortgage or the headache of replacing a water heater. So are these institutional buyers entirely predatory, or are they just serving a shift in consumer demand?
That is the defense often mounted by the industry, and it's a totally fair question. However, the source's argument is that this isn't a natural evolution of consumer preference. It is a forced paradigm shift.
Forced how?
Well, yes, some people desire mobility, but the overwhelming data suggests that the vast majority of people still strongly desire homeownership for its stability and its wealth-building capacity. The issue is that the institutional advantage doesn't just serve an existing rental market, it artificially expands it by actively cannibalizing the inventory meant for first-time buyers.
Ah, I see.
When an LLC, backed by a hedge fund, offers 10% over asking price in cash with zero contingencies, the regular family is mathematically locked out of the transaction. They aren't choosing to rent for mobility, they're being forced to rent because they cannot compete in the acquisition phase.
Wow. And the demographics bear this out in a terrifying way. The source highlights that the median age for a first-time homebuyer has now reached 40 years old. Let's just pause on that. 40. A generation ago, the expectation was your mid-20s.
The mathematical ripple effect of that 15-year delay is devastating to the middle class. If you purchase a home at 25, you have 4 decades of prime earning years to pay down the principal on that asset. You allow the macro trend of real estate appreciation to work in your favor.
Right, letting time do the work.
Exactly. By the time you're 45, you likely have significant equity. You can borrow against that equity to start a small business, to fund a child's higher education, or to weather a medical emergency without going bankrupt. You are letting the phenomena of compounding interest do the heavy lifting of wealth creation.
You're establishing a permanent foundation.
But if you are pushed out of the acquisition phase until you're 40, that timeline is critically compressed. The window for building equity before traditional retirement age is effectively cut in half. The source argues that this delay fundamentally breaks the primary wealth-building engine of the working class.
Because historically, equity in a primary residence is how generational wealth has been established and transferred down the family tree in this country.
Precisely. Stunting that timeline by 15 years doesn't just hurt the 40-year-old buyer, it structurally impoverishes their future children.
Okay, so Wall Street is buying up the starter homes and pricing out the families. But what about the rental market itself? Because it's not like massive hedge funds are the only people who rent out properties. What about the traditional independent landlords, like the local mom and pop who maybe own a duplex across town or held on to their first starter home when they upgraded to build a little retirement income? Where do they fit into this machine?
This is where we see what the source implies might be a coordinated playbook, and it revolves around municipal and state-level policy. The environment for the small, independent property owner has become incredibly hostile, almost by design.
Right. Are the governments of the world playing out a specific playbook here? Because when you look at the landscape for independent landlords, it feels less like a free market and more like a targeted demolition.
Let's examine the pincer movement the source describes. On one flank, you have the rapid inflation of operational costs. Local municipalities, eager for revenue, are aggressively reassessing property values, which leads to drastic increases in property taxes.
Which is a killer.
It is. And simultaneously, the cost of materials for maintenance, labor for repairs, and property insurance have all skyrocketed. So the independent landlord's baseline cost to simply maintain the asset is surging.
And what's happening on the other flank?
On the other flank, many of these same municipalities and state governments are implementing strict rent control measures, rent freezes, or extending eviction moratoriums that were initially justified by crisis conditions but have become semi-permanent fixtures.
So you have a scenario where the small landlord's operational costs, like the taxes and insurance they are legally required to pay, are going up 30–40%.
Yeah.
But their revenue is legally capped. They are literally barred by the government from adjusting their prices to match the inflation of their costs.
Precisely. The margins for a small landlord are usually quite thin to begin with. They don't have the vast reserves of a corporate firm. When the costs exceed the legally capped revenue, they are operating at a net loss.
They're just bleeding cash.
Yeah, they cannot afford to replace the roof or update the plumbing, which then opens them up to code violations or tenant disputes. They are bleeding capital every single month.
And they make zero profit. The asset becomes a liability. So what is the inevitable outcome? They are forced to sell, they have to liquidate to stop the bleeding. But who is sitting there ready to buy a distressed property that needs a new roof? It's not a young family.
No, it is the exact same multi-billion-dollar institutional investors we just discussed. They swoop in with massive reserves of cash, purchase the distressed property at a slight discount, and absorb it into their massive portfolio.
It's a systematic clearing of the board. You price the new retail buyers out through unfair competitive advantages in the bidding war, and you regulate the existing small owners out through impossible local mandates. And suddenly, the only entity left standing, the only landlord left in town, is a faceless, centralized corporation.
And this transition from millions of dispersed independent property owners to a handful of highly centralized corporate aggregators is the macro foundation for the rest of the source's argument. Because if you can't own the physical shelter you live in, the next logical assumption is that at least you own the items inside the shelter, right? The things you use every day.
But you don't. The moat Wall Street, built around the housing market, is identical to the philosophy quietly infecting the microeconomy. The permanent renter model isn't just for houses anymore. It is for literally everything. The data here is wild. According to the source, the average American now spends $3,276 annually on subscriptions.
Wow.
Right. Think about that. Over $3,000 a year just to access things you used to possess.
It is a profound shift from capital expenditure, buying an asset once, to operational expenditure, treating your personal life like a corporate balance sheet where everything is a continuous liability. And it happens so incrementally that the temperature of the water rises without the frog ever noticing it's boiling.
I think we have to ask ourselves, though, haven't we kind of been willingly tricked by the illusion of convenience? I always think about the vanishing hammer analogy.
I love this analogy. Let's hear it.
So if I need a hammer to build a shelf, I can go to the hardware store and buy one for $20. I own it. It sits in my garage for 30 years. I can give it to my kid. But the subscription model is like someone saying, hey, don't pay $20. That's so expensive. Just pay me $1 a month. And you can use this hammer whenever you want. It feels incredibly cheap today. It feels like a life hack.
Lower barrier to entry.
Exactly. But the absolute second you stop paying that monthly dollar, the hammer vanishes from your toolbox. You are left with a half-built shelf and no tools. We used to buy software like Microsoft Office or Adobe Photoshop on a CD-ROM. You paid a chunk of money once, and you owned version 7.0 forever. Now it's a monthly fee.
The vanishing hammer is a perfect illustration of the back-end mechanics of this new economy. Let's look at why recurring revenue is the absolute holy grail for these corporations and why they are abandoning the one-time purchase model entirely. I think you were hypothesizing earlier about customer acquisition costs.
Right, because I have to imagine it fundamentally shifts the burden of acquisition. Like when I bought that Photoshop CD in 2005, Adobe got my money once. If they wanted my money again in 2008, they had to spend millions of dollars on research and development to make a genuinely better product, and then spend millions more on marketing to convince me to go back to the store and buy it.
Yes, they had to earn your business all over again.
Exactly, but once I'm locked into an ecosystem where I pay $10 a month, their marketing budget to acquire me drops to zero. I am just on the treadmill.
You've hit on the exact mechanism. It transitions the corporate model from requiring constant, risky product innovation to merely managing predictable cash flow. And as the source points out, this deeply embeds what the industry calls captive customers. The friction to leave the ecosystem becomes higher than the friction of paying the monthly fee.
Because you literally can't leave without destroying a piece of your life. Like if you use a cloud subscription for your family photos and you hit hard financial times and need to cancel, your memories are held hostage. You lose your past.
It's extremely punitive.
It is. And if your car requires a subscription to utilize the heated seats or the remote start, which is a very real current trend among major automakers, you never truly possess the physical machine sitting in your driveway. The manufacturer can alter the physical utility of your vehicle remotely. You are utterly dependent on continuous, uninterrupted payments just to maintain your daily digital and physical baseline.
If we synthesize this with the broader economic picture the source is painting, we arrive at a devastating conclusion regarding systemic wealth transfer. The subscription economy fundamentally severs your ability to accumulate tangible assets. Think about what a physical library of owned software, an owned vehicle, a collection of physical media, or a paid-off house represents. It represents stored energy.
Stored energy, I like that.
Value that you hold, independently of the corporation that manufactured it. Value that you can liquidate if needed, or value that you can pass down.
But I can't pass down a Netflix profile to my children. I can't leave them a Spotify playlist in my will. It has zero retained value.
Exactly. When your life is entirely composed of access fees and subscriptions, your personal net worth effectively flatlines. You are generating immense economic value through your labor every single day, but you are retaining almost none of it. Every dollar evaporates at the end of the month to maintain your access to the tools of modern life. All the equity, all the stored value flows aggressively upward to the centralized corporations providing the services. You are a pure revenue stream.
Okay, this is where we have to take a massive step back because this paints a very specific, almost architectural economic picture. We are locked out of the macro asset of housing by institutional cash advantages, and our micro assets are being stripped away by 1,000 tiny monthly subscription cuts. We are generating wealth, but keeping none of it. Which brings us to the massive, overarching question of this deep dive. Are these interconnected trends, being priced out of ownership and seamlessly guided into renting your entire existence, are they just accidental byproducts of a hyper-efficient modern capitalism? Is this just the invisible hand of the free market optimizing for digital delivery? Or do they align with a much broader, highly intentional ideological playbook?
And that profound pivot brings us directly into the territory of our second source, which shifts the lens from pure economic analysis to the theater of global politics.
Now we enter the terrain of the political commentary video, and the source makes a very bold claim right out of the gate. They argued that the current geopolitical landscape is no longer defined by the traditional 20th century paradigms of left versus right or Democrat versus Republican.
They assert that those party lines are essentially illusions, or at least outdated models.
Right. Instead, they define the primary existential conflict of our time as the battle between nationalists or patriot factions, people who believe in localized sovereignty and traditional borders on one side, and globalists on the other.
And this source zeroes in heavily on one specific organization as the primary engine and ideological incubator for this globalist influence, the World Economic Forum, the WEF, spearheaded by Klaus Schwab.
What are they actually claiming is happening?
It is essential to map out the mechanics of their claim. The source argues that the fundamental agenda of Davos, the annual meeting place for the WEF and the global elite, is to execute a permanent merger between the public sector, meaning governments, and the private sector, meaning megacorporations. The goal, according to the source, is to enforce a top-down, highly standardized, anti-tradition societal agenda.
Let's break down that concept of merging public and private, because on the surface, a public-private partnership sounds innocuous. It sounds like a city hiring a private construction firm to build a better bridge. But the source is implying something far more insidious. How do they mechanically define this merger?
The source asserts that this globalist model aims to transition Western democratic nations toward a system that heavily resembles the operational structure of China.
Fair.
Now, when they draw that comparison, they aren't necessarily talking about adopting a formal communist manifesto.
Right. It's not about the economic theory necessarily.
Exactly. They are specifically pointing to the infrastructure of control. A society characterized by intense, digitized surveillance, social credit mechanics, and a radical reduction in individual liberty and financial autonomy.
Let's talk about those social credit mechanics, because that phrase gets thrown around a lot as a buzzword. But how does it actually function in the context of a public-private merger? I always think of it like a bouncer at a club.
How so?
Well, if the government wants to restrict your behavior, say they want to limit how much meat you buy or how much fuel you use to combat climate change, passing a law to do that is incredibly difficult in a constitutional republic. It requires debate, voting, and faces immense legal challenges regarding civil liberties.
Very true.
But what if the government just whispers to the bouncer? What if the state tells Visa, MasterCard, and the massive consolidated banking sector to simply decline transactions that exceed a carbon quota? The government didn't touch you, they didn't pass a law, the private sector enforced the state's desired behavior.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the concept of stakeholder capitalism, which is a term heavily promoted by the WEF and heavily critiqued by the source. In traditional shareholder capitalism, a corporation's only duty is to maximize profit for its owners.
Right, the shareholders.
But in stakeholder capitalism, corporations are tasked with serving broader societal stakeholders and advancing social, environmental, or political goals. The source argues that this creates a massive loophole around constitutional rights.
Because they bypass the Constitution completely?
Exactly. The state doesn't have to violate your freedom of speech or your freedom of movement if the private monopolies that control your communication platforms, your banking, and your housing simply revoke your services for non-compliance with the standardized agenda. Corporate power and state power become indistinguishable. They act as a unified enforcement mechanism.
Wow. Okay, so here is where the two sources we've been analyzing violently collide. If we take the economic trends from source one, the engineered creation of a permanent renter class, the subscription life, the elimination of tangible assets, and overlay them onto the political and structural claims from source two, the synergy is genuinely terrifying. It fits together like a lock and key.
It is an incredibly potent structural synthesis. Let's look at the raw physics of societal control. If you have a population composed of individuals who own their land, who own their homes outright, who possess independent means of transportation, and who hold zero debt, that population is extremely difficult to manage from the top down.
Yeah, they have complete localized sovereignty.
Exactly. They have a massive tangible buffer against coercion.
Because they can simply say no. They have a castle to retreat to. If the centralized authority demands compliance with a new mandate, the property owner can shut their door and live off their own stored value.
Ownership is the ultimate friction to centralized authority. But if you look at the population source one says is currently being engineered, a population of permanent renters, a populace with zero accumulated equity, living paycheck to paycheck, totally and utterly dependent on a web of monthly digital subscriptions for their software, their entertainment, their transportation, their communication, and most importantly, their physical shelter. That population is spectacularly vulnerable. They have no buffer.
This completely changes how you view the housing crisis. If the globalist institutions, as the source claims, want to merge public and private power to establish seamless top-down control, are the institutional private equity firms buying up all our single-family homes, essentially acting as the private arm of this agenda?
That's the implication, yes.
Think about it. If Wall Street owns the entire neighborhood, and Wall Street executives are intimately aligned with the ideological goals of Davos, you don't need a heavy-handed government edict or a police force to control the population. You just raise the rent on political dissidents. Or you remotely turn off the smart locks on the apartment of someone whose social credit score dropped because they attended the wrong protest.
This is the exact systemic threat the political source is raising. The argument is that the economic trends we discussed are not an accidental byproduct of a free market gone slightly awry. The assertion is that systematically pushing the middle class away from private ownership and forcing them into a subscription-based rented existence is a mandatory prerequisite for implementing a surveillance-heavy, top-down societal model.
Because you can't control people who don't need you.
You mathematically cannot implement a frictionless social control system in a nation of fiercely independent, well-capitalized property-owning citizens. The infrastructure of ownership must be eroded first.
Which suddenly makes that squeeze on the independent mom-and-pop landlords we talked about earlier look incredibly sinister. It looks a lot less like a clumsy local tax issue and a lot more like a deliberate, systemic clearing of the board. You wipe out the independent property owners who might harbor diverse, localized values. You consolidate the physical housing stock into a few compliant corporate hands, and suddenly the public-private partnership has unmitigated leverage over the basic survival of the average citizen.
And that hyper-centralization of economic and political power is precisely what the second source argues the public is beginning to recognize. The illusion is breaking. Which transitions us to the crucial question of reaction. If this massive macro-level machinery is bearing down on the population, how are individuals and localized communities responding?
Right, because human beings don't just sit back and accept algorithmic subjugation. There is immense friction. This brings us to Section 4. The pushback. Local activism versus global standardization. Our political source spends significant time outlining how conservative, traditional, and patriot factions are attempting to throw a wrench in the gears.
And what's fascinating is where they are focusing their energy.
Yeah. They aren't looking to massive federal elections or Washington, D.C. as their primary battleground. They are looking at their own backyards.
The source frames localized sovereignty as the only viable antidote to global standardization. When the threat is top-down homogenization, the defense must be bottom-up, hyper-local friction.
The source provides a very specific, illuminating case study to illustrate this. The Caldwell School District. According to the video, parents mobilized and showed up en masse to a local school board meeting to aggressively and successfully oppose a proposed policy regarding bathroom access.
Right, a highly localized issue.
Exactly. Now, on the surface, if you are looking at the massive geopolitical board we just laid out, a heated debate in a school cafeteria about bathrooms seems trivial. It seems a million miles away from Klaus Schwab, institutional housing investors, and digital social credit systems. But the source intimately ties them together. How does a school board fight relate to the WEFE?
It relates fundamentally through the mechanics of implementation. What the source is highlighting in the Caldwell case study is the raw, unglamorous mechanics of local engagement acting as a physical block to globalist architecture.
A physical block.
Yes. The globalist model, as defined by the source, relies entirely on passive compliance. It relies on policies, ideologies, and standardized norms being drafted in distant, insulated think tanks, passed down through vast federal bureaucracies or non-governmental organizations, and quietly, frictionlessly implemented at the absolute lowest local level.
It's a silent takeover. The federal guideline comes down, the local board rubber stamps it to ensure they keep getting their federal grant money, and the culture shifts without a single vote ever being cast by the actual citizens of the town.
Exactly. The local school board is the final terminal, where the top-down data is downloaded into the community. But when parents suddenly wake up, physically show up at that meeting, demand transparency, and force a vote, they are severing the connection.
They pull the plug.
They're throwing a massive wrench into the machinery of passive compliance. They are asserting that the values of the local geography supersede the standardized mandates of the centralized bureaucracy. The source argues that grassroots engagement, actually being physically present in your community, understanding who sits on these obscure local boards, voting in the elections that have 12% turnout, is the primary and perhaps the only effective mechanical defense against institutional overreach. You stop the mandate at the choke point.
Which brings up a really fascinating philosophical and strategic debate happening within conservative and traditional circles right now, and the source tackles it head on. It's the debate around the old political adage that politics is downstream of culture.
Ah, yes, the Breitbart philosophy.
Right. The idea, popularized heavily by figures like Andrew Breitbart, that if you want to win the political war, you first have to win the cultural arguments. You have to make the best movies, write the best music, control the curriculum in the schools, and the political victories will eventually naturally follow.
It's a philosophy of gradual persuasion. Win the hearts and minds, and the laws will reflect that shift.
Right. But the source we are analyzing vigorously challenges this idea. They don't dismiss the importance of culture, but they argue that this specific phrase has mutated. It has been weaponized as an excuse by politicians who are too cowardly to actually wield power. They use it as a shield.
How do you mean?
Well, the politician says, oh, we can't pass this aggressive legislation to stop corporate overreach, or we can't aggressively dismantle this bureaucracy because the culture just isn't ready yet. We have to do the hard work of changing the culture first, so vote for me again and wait.
This raises a profoundly important question about the raw nature of institutional power. The source argues that while cultural work, art, discourse, education is undeniably vital, you absolutely cannot cede the hard political and legislative battlefield while you wait for a generational cultural shift. Because the opposition is not waiting.
Oh, absolutely not.
The institutional private equity firms buying up the starter homes aren't waiting for a cultural consensus on housing fairness. The tech monopolies transitioning everything to captive subscriptions aren't waiting for consumers to culturally accept it. The institutions pushing standardized mandates down to the school boards aren't waiting. They are aggressively exercising raw economic and political power in the present moment.
They are moving the pieces on the board while the other side is trying to write a better song about the game. So what does this all mean for the pushback? Are cultural victories, like the Caldwell School Board protest, enough? Or is the source demanding something far more aggressive from these patriot factions?
The source forcefully argues that factions resisting this top-down standardization must take both cultural and aggressive political action simultaneously. It's an assertion that recognizing real hard power dynamics is essential for survival.
You have to play both games.
Exactly. If the opposing agenda involves intentionally merging public state power and private corporate power to enforce rules and strip assets, then the pushback must involve using legitimate, hard political power to aggressively block those monopolies, dismantle the public-private partnerships, and pass laws that legally protect individual rights and localized sovereignty. You cannot just win the intellectual argument on a podcast or at a school board meeting. The source claims you have to be willing to actually grab the levers of government and pass the laws that protect your specific way of life. It is a demand to move from passive cultural resistance to active institutional dismantling.
It's a call to actually play the game of power, rather than just complaining about the referee, which brings us down from the geopolitical clouds right back to the ground level, right back to you, the listener, sitting in your car or your living room. Because honestly, hearing all this, the massive orchestrated wealth transfers, the WEF's global ambitions, the multi-billion-dollar corporate buyouts of middle-class neighborhoods, it can induce a profound sense of vertigo. It can feel incredibly overwhelming.
Oh, without a doubt. It feels like the game is totally rigged, the board is bought, and you are just waiting to pay rent.
It is designed to feel overwhelming. That scale of centralization intentionally induces a sense of paralysis in the individual. You think, I'm just one person, what can I do against BlackRock and Davos? But we are not going to leave you in that state of paralysis. That is not what the Mind Lounge Podcast Network is about.
Absolutely not.
Welcome to Section 5, Reclaiming Independence, Solutions, and Strategies. How do you actually navigate this hostile architecture? How do you protect yourself, your capital, and your family's future?
We have to start by fundamentally reframing our view of the future. There's a critical, empowering takeaway embedded deeply within the first economic source, and it's this. Absolutely none of this is a guaranteed inevitable future.
Let me repeat that because it's the most important thing we'll say today. This is not an inevitable future. It is not physics. It is a choice.
The transition to a permanent renter class, the subscription microeconomy, the localized mandates, these are the direct result of specific corporate business models, specific municipal policy choices, and heavily manipulated economic incentives. It is a constructed artificial reality. And what has been meticulously built by policy and corporate strategy can be actively countered, dismantled, or bypassed by conscious individual and collective choice.
So let's talk real, actionable takeaways based on the synthesis of these sources. Step 1 is almost laughably simple on the surface, but profoundly effective in reality. You have to audit your life for subscription creep. You have to consciously stop the bleeding of your microcapital.
It requires a ruthless, conscious auditing of your daily conveniences. You have to look at your bank statement and ask hard questions. Do I truly need to pay $15 a month forever for this specific word processing software, or is there a free, open source alternative that does the exact same thing?
Right. Do I need 5 different streaming services running simultaneously?
Exactly. Or can I cancel 4, keep 1, and start building a physical media library of the films I actually care about? It is about consciously choosing to step off the recurring revenue treadmill, wherever mathematically possible.
Reclaim the hammer, folks. Go to the store, buy the physical hammer, and keep it in your garage. Cancel the cloud storage and buy a 1 terabyte external hard drive that sits on your desk, fully under your physical control. But what about the macro picture? What about the massive structural housing crisis?
That's the bigger challenge.
It is. If you are a 30-year-old couple looking at 7% interest rates, massive down payment requirements, and neighborhoods being systematically bought up by private equity cash offers, what do you actually do? You can't just cancel lack of housing.
The overarching desperate directive derived from the economic source is this. You must focus on tangible asset ownership as your primary overriding financial and life goal. In a world and an economy that is structurally, desperately trying to push you toward renting your entire existence, aggressively pursuing and holding a tangible asset is no longer just a standard financial strategy for retirement. It is an active act of rebellion.
It's a declaration of financial independence, but we have to talk about how to actually get there creatively, because the traditional front door path, going to the bank, getting a standard mortgage, outbidding the hedge fund, is functionally blocked for a huge percentage of the population. And this is where some truly fascinating alternative localized models are beginning to bubble up, things that completely bypass the mega corporations and the massive banking institutions entirely.
Yes, we are seeing the emergence of highly localized networks, moving away from extractive, permanent renting toward creative equity-building models.
Let's talk about a specific solution that connects the dots of our housing discussion: modernizing the simple rent-to-own model. Because earlier, we talked in depth about how local policies, skyrocketing taxes, and rigid rent freezes are slowly squeezing the life out of independent mom-and-pop landlords, forcing them to sell to Wall Street.
Right, the pincer movement.
But what if those distressed independent landlords and those frustrated locked-out prospective buyers teamed up to mutually bypass the institutional predators?
It's a brilliantly elegant, localized solution. Imagine a legally structured, hyper-transparent rent-to-own agreement between an independent property owner and a dedicated tenant. Instead of the tenant simply throwing $2,000 of rent into a black hole every month with zero return, a contractually obligated portion of that monthly payment, say $300 or $400, is diverted directly into a dedicated escrow exit account.
It's a forced savings mechanism. They are steadily automatically building their down payment while they are already living in the house.
Exactly. And to make it mutually beneficial, the tenant could legally agree to take on a portion of the escalating property tax burden, or contractually agree to handle all routine maintenance and minor repairs.
Oh, wow. That's smart.
It is, because this immediately takes the immense crippling financial pressure off the independent landlord, protecting them from the systemic squeeze that usually forces them to sell to BlackRock, while simultaneously giving the tenant a clear, guaranteed contractual pathway to actual ownership.
It completely aligns the incentives of both parties. The landlord gets reliable, headache-free income and property maintenance without going bankrupt or fighting the city code enforcement, and the renter actually gets real skin in the game. They aren't just consumers, they are future owners. And think about what that mechanism does to a person's psychology and, by extension, the psychology of the town.
It's a total paradigm shift.
It really is. When you are just renting a sterile apartment from a faceless multinational mega corporation, you do not care if the hallway paint is chipping. You don't care if the landscaping dies. You don't put down roots. You are transient.
The psychological impact of ownership, or even the guaranteed pursuit of ownership, cannot be overstated. It fundamentally alters your behavioral relationship with your physical environment. When you own the property, or when your monthly labor is actively building equity toward owning it, you experience a deep inherent sense of pride. You voluntarily invest your time in the upkeep.
You actually care what happens.
You start paying close attention to what happens to the local school board or the city council's zoning meetings, because their arbitrary decisions now directly impact the value of your tangible asset.
It brings genuine respect and cohesion back to the community. You are no longer a transient consumer passing through a corporate holding facility. You are a stakeholder. You belong there. Your family is anchored there. And that, right there, is the ultimate impenetrable defense against the top-down globalist control the second source warned us about. A geographically anchored community of deeply invested stakeholders is nearly impossible for a centralized bureaucracy to push around.
Because ownership provides the essential buffer. It provides the sovereignty required to say no. Whether it is a piece of land, a physical house, a localized network of food production, a physical library of media, or the unnetworked tools of your trade. Tangible assets ensure that you cannot simply be switched off, throttled, or exiled if you happen to fail to pay your monthly tribute to a corporate monopoly, or if you run afoul of a standardized political mandate.
And that brings us to the grand synthesis of this entire deep dive. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today, connecting seemingly disparate dots across the spectrum of our lives. We started with the very real, very painful mathematical reality that nearly 50 cents of every dollar you earn is being eaten alive by housing costs.
Yeah, the 47.7%.
Exactly. We looked deeply into the mechanics of how institutional investors, armed with cheap debt and cash offers, combined with hostile local policies, are systematically squeezing out the independent owners and pushing the dream of basic homeownership back to age 40 and beyond.
We examine the insidious microeconomy of subscription creep, the sneaky, incremental $3,000 a year quietly draining from our accounts, transferring our wealth aggressively upward, severing our ability to build generational equity, and turning us into captive, dependent consumers.
And then we zoomed way, way out. We looked at the geopolitical arguments surrounding the WEF, Klaus Schwab, and the globalist agenda. We unpack the terrifying synergy of how merging public-state power with private corporate monopolies requires a compliant, assetless, permanent renter class to function smoothly. We saw how the bouncer at the club can enforce the state's rules without a single law being passed.
Which is a terrifying concept.
It really is. And finally, we brought it all back down to the local dirt. The Caldwell School Board protests, the absolute necessity of rejecting top-down mandates at the choke points, the danger of waiting for culture to change instead of wielding political power, and the crucial rebellious act of pursuing tangible ownership through creative, localized models like rent-to-own.
It is an incredibly complex, interwoven web of economics, psychology, and politics, but understanding the precise threads of that web is the absolute first step to untangling them in your own life. Which leaves us with a final lingering thought.
Okay, let's hear it.
This raises an intensely important question. If the historical definition of human freedom was deeply, inextricably tied to the physical land, the tangible assets you held in your own name, and society is now rapidly, intentionally moving toward a frictionless model where literally everything is a rented service conditionally granted by a centralized authority, what happens to the core concept of self-reliance for the next generation? Will the ultimate untouchable luxury in the future simply be the ability to stand in your living room and say, I own this, and nobody can turn it off?
Wow, that is going to stick with me for a long time. I own this and nobody can turn it off. The ultimate luxury. I want to sincerely thank you, the listener, for joining us on this edition of The Deep Dive from the Mind Lounge Podcast Network. This was a heavy, dense one, but it is so incredibly important to look these mechanical trends right in the eye, to understand the architecture of the game being played. So take some time this week. Sit down and aggressively audit your subscriptions. Cancel the excess. Pay close attention to who is sitting on your local city council and your school boards. Look for creative, localized ways to build actual equity instead of just paying endless rent to a corporation. Keep your eyes wide open, fiercely protect your assets, and most importantly, stay relentlessly curious. We will catch you on the next Deep Dive.
Daddy built his house by hand, boards and nails and busted plans, front porch creaking in the rain. Now the bank's got our last name. Mama sorting overdue bills, stacked up high beside the pills. TV glowing cold and blue, selling dreams we can't break through. Everybody's paying, nobody owns, living like strangers inside our homes. Under rented skies, under borrowed light, working all day just to make it through the night. Everything we love slips away in time. We're just passing through. Under rented skies, every song is locked away, every screen demands we pay. Monthly charges, endless change, different logos, same old pain. Kids grow up without a yard, living life on credit cards. Landlords rule the neighborhood, bought the things our fathers could. Everybody's tired, everybody knows the door stays open, but nobody goes under any skies, under borrowed light, working all day just to make it through the night. Everything we love slips away in time, we're just passing through. Under any sky, oh. We sold tomorrow to survive today, little pieces of ourselves given all away. Now the keys don't open nothing, they just prove we paid. And freedom feels like something folks forgot to save. Under any skies, under neon nights, trying to hold on to a disappearing life. Everything we love fades before our eyes, we're just shadows now. Skies, under rented skies, under rented skies.